collecting all the force that he could command, so as to organize a grand expedition to proceed to the southward, and endeavour to find some pleasant country which they could seize and settle upon, and make their own. The desperate adventurers around him were ready enough to enter into this scheme. The fleet was refitted, provisioned, and equipped. The expedition was organized, arms and munitions of war provided, and when all was ready they set sail. They had no definite plan in respect to the place of their destination, their intention being to make themselves a home on the first favourable spot that they could find. They moved southward, cruising at first along the coast of Scotland, and then of England. They made several fruitless attempts to land on the English shores, but were everywhere repulsed. The time when these events took place was during the reign of Alfred the Great. Through Alfred's wise and efficient measures, the whole of his frontier had been put into a perfect state of defence, and Rollo found that there was no hope for him there. He accordingly moved on toward the Straits of Dover, but, before passing them, he made a descent upon the coast of Flanders. Here there was a country named Hainault. It was governed by a potentate called the Count of Hainault. Rollo made war upon him, defeated him in battle, took him prisoner, and then compelled the countess, his wife, to raise and pay him an immense sum for his ransom. Thus he replenished his treasury by an exploit which was considered in those days very great and glorious. To perpetrate such a deed now, unless it were on a very great scale, would be to incur the universal reprobation of mankind, but Rollo, by doing it then, not only enriched his coffers, but acquired a very extended and honourable fame. For some reason or other, Rollo did not attempt to make permanent possession of Hainault, but after receiving his ransom money and replenishing his ammunition and stores, he sailed away with his fleet, and, turning westward, he passed through the Straits of Dover, and cruised along the coast of France. He found that the country on the French side of the Channel, though equally rich and beautiful with the opposite shore, was in a very different state of defence. He entered the mouth of the Seine. He was embarrassed at first by the difficulties of the navigation in entering the river, but as there was no efficient enemy to oppose him, he soon triumphed over these difficulties, and, once fairly in the river, he found no difficulty in ascending to Rouen. In the meantime, the King of France, whose name was Charles, and who is generally designated in history as Charles the Simple, began to collect an army to meet the invader. Rollo, however, had made himself master of Rouen before Charles was able to offer him any effectual opposition. Rouen was already a strong place, but Rollo made it stronger. He enlarged and repaired the fortifications, built storehouses, established a garrison, and in a word made all the arrangements requisite for securing an impregnable position for himself and his army. A long and obstinate war followed between Rollo and Charles, Rollo being almost uniformly victorious in the combats that took place. Rollo became more and more proud and imperious in proportion to his success. He drove the French king from port to port and from field to field, until he made himself master of a large part of the north of France, over which he gradually established a regular government of his own. Charles struggled in vain to resist these encroachments. Rollo continually defeated him, and finally he shut him up and besieged him in Paris itself. At length Charles was compelled to enter into negotiations for peace. Rollo demanded that the large and rich tract on both sides of the Seine, next the sea, the same, in fact, that now constitutes Normandy, should be ceded to him and his followers for their permanent possession. Charles was extremely unwilling thus to alienate a part of his kingdom. He would not consent to cede it absolutely and entirely, so as to make it an independent realm. It should be a dukedom, and not a separate kingdom, so that it might continue still a part of his royal domains, Rollo to reign over it as a duke, and to acknowledge a general allegiance to the French king. Rollo agreed to this. The war had been now protracted so long that he began himself to desire repose. It was more than 30 years since the time of his landing. Charles had a daughter named Giselle, and it was a part of the treaty of peace that she should become Rollo's wife. He also agreed to become a Christian. Thus there were, in the execution of the treaty, 3 ceremonies to be performed. First, Rollo was to do homage, as it was called, for his duchy, for it was the custom in those days for subordinate princes, who held their possessions of some higher and more strictly sovereign power, to perform certain ceremonies in the presence of their superior lord, which was called doing homage. These ceremonies were of various kinds in different countries, though they were all intended to express the submission of the dependent prince to the superior authority and power of the higher potentate, of whom he held his lands. This act of homage was therefore to be performed, and next to the homage was to come the baptism, and after the baptism the marriage. When, however, the time came for the performance of the first of these ceremonies, and all the great chieftains and potentates of the respective armies were assembled to witness it, Rollo, it was found, would not submit to what the customs of the French monarchy required. He ought to kneel before the king, and put his hands clasped together between the king's hands, in token of submission, and then to kiss his foot, which was covered with an elegantly fashioned slipper on such occasions. Rollo would do all except the last, but that no remonstrances, urgencies, or persuasions would induce him to consent to. And yet it was not a very unusual sign or token of political subordination to sovereign power in those days. The Pope had exacted it even of an emperor 100 years before, and it is continued by that dignitary to the present day on certain state occasions, though in the case of the Pope there is embroidered on the slipper which the kneeling suppliant kisses a cross, so that he who humbles himself to this ceremony may consider, if he pleases, that it is that sacred symbol of the divine Redeemer's sufferings and death that he so reverently kisses, and not the human foot by which it is covered. Rollo could not be made to consent himself to kiss King Charles's foot, and finally the difficulty was compromised by his agreeing to do it by proxy. He ordered one of his courtiers to perform that part of the ceremony. The courtier obeyed, but when he came to lift the foot, he did it so rudely, and lifted it so high, so as to turn the monarch over off his seat. This made a laugh, but Rollo was too powerful for Charles to think of resenting it. A few days after this Rollo was baptized in the cathedral church at Rouen, with great pomp and parade, and then on the following week he was married to Giselle. The din of war, in which he had lived for more than 30 years, was now changed into festivities and rejoicings. He took full and peaceable possession of his dukedom, and governed it for the remainder of his days with great wisdom, and lived in great prosperity. He made it, in fact, one of the richest and most prosperous realms in Europe, and laid the foundations of still higher degrees of greatness and power, which were gradually developed after his death. And this was the origin of Normandy. It appears thus that this part of France was seized by Rollo and his Norsemen, partly because it was nearest at hand to them, being accessible from the English Channel through the river Seine, and partly on account of its exceeding richness and fertility. It has been famous in every age as the Garden of France, and travellers at the present day gaze upon its picturesque and beautiful scenery with the highest admiration and pleasure. And yet the scenes which are there represented to the view are wholly unlike those which constitute picturesque and beautiful rural scenery in England and America. In Normandy the land is not enclosed; no hedges, fences, or walls break the continuity of the surface, but vast tracts spreading